Hi, I'm Tori. This is Fully Booked, and for one of my first videos I thought I would sneak in like just before the end of Black History Month to talk a little bit about what I read over the course of the month by Black writers. And I usually post on my social media like a list of recommended reads every year for Black History Month, Indigenous History Month, Pride. And so this year I'm going to try this way instead. I'll share in the comments like some of my past lists and also my Goodreads reviews for the books I'm going to talk about today. So the first book that I really loved that I want to talk about that I read this month is Raybearer by Jordan Akwaeke, and this is a debut novel and I am seriously impressed. Raybearer is the story of a lonely girl named Tressie who is sent to join the Prince's Council. It's a, I would say, YA fantasy, and throughout the novel Tressie finds her purpose and her family. So I really like the way this book is an iteration of the found family trope. It's very sweet. And I am, just impressed by how strong this is for a debut novel. Akwaeke is Nigerian American, and you can see clear West African influences in the empire of Aritsar that she creates in this book. I thought, the empire itself was very impressive and layered in its portrayal, especially nuanced for something that is YA literature. She also managed to defy my expectations with respect to major plot twists and smaller things like who's the main love story and things like that. So I think this book is great. There were a few things that were a little bit cheesy, just the council concept that's a really big part of the book felt a little bit forced to me because there's 12 kids who are the main council, and they get something called council sickness if they're not close to each other, and so that manifests in them always kind of touching each other, and it was kind of this cliche YA thing going on there that I didn't love, but I think I have those hang-ups kind of with the whole genre. Also, just having 12 characters is just way too many, I think, for, I'm a person who really needs very deep character development, and it's just impossible with 12 to really get that. So you've got probably more 4 characters that really have deep characterization, which is still great because there's not any sort of that insta love thing that kind of happens a lot in YA where there's pretty shallow character development. So I still thought some of the characters were really well developed. The council concept in general I think was mostly my hang up because it got kind of convoluted at the end, also with the sort of twist that's revealed towards the end of the book. But in general, really great folklore, really great world building. There's a lot of creative things happening here, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So yeah, check out Jordan Akwaeke. It's a duology, the Raybearer series, and so the second book will be released in August, and I'm really excited to read it. It's definitely going on my TBR. The next book that I wanted to recommend is called The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. This is also a debut novel. Shout out to Tor Books because they have these, I get the newsletter from Tor, and I just get a lot of recommendations for new authors and new books to read that are in many cases very good. So Year of the Witching is a really dark and hypnotic book. The prose is really good. I actually read this one as an audiobook, and the audio was really great too. Very atmospheric. It's essentially about a girl in a cult, sort of a puritanical cult in the woods. Kind of gives me like a post-apocalyptic vibe, but honestly, it could just be another world. And I was really interested in the portrayal of witches in this book. I feel like there's kind of this new, you know, we're the granddaughters of the witches you didn't burn thing going on, with like reclaiming witches, and I think that's awesome, but it's like, it's kind of becoming a little bit more rote, and this book does not fall into that. I was impressed with sort of the unique portrayal here of the witches in the novel. I won't say more than that to avoid spoiling. I didn't really feel like it was clear to me, you know, this book is listed as adult fiction. I think the author has said like this is meant to be adult fiction, and that comes through in the darkness and like creepiness that's going on. But I think it kind of seems like it can't really decide whether it's YA or adult fiction, which is fine, but I think the like character and the love story was a little bit more YA, and it felt like a clash with the world, and so that was definitely an aspect that I didn't love as much. It just felt more like geared towards that preteen audience, the like central relationship. But you know, this is a first novel. I think it was really good. Again, the prose was great. The atmosphere was great. The pacing was not my favorite. It kind of dragged in the last half. But yeah, again, first novel, very impressed. I gave it 3 stars. This might be a really good read for like October, like spooky season. I definitely get that vibe from this book. The next thing that I read that I thought was worth recommending is actually poetry. So, like I think I mentioned in my intro video, like I am a big cross-genre reader, so I also read poetry. Sometimes I write it. And so I really wanted to recommend I Think I'm Ready to See Frank Ocean by Shayla Lawson. If you're into poetry. Also, if you're into Frank Ocean. I am a fan, but I am not like a super deep fan, and so I did have to read this book twice to really, and re-listen to some of Frank Ocean's discography to get some of the like crossover between the themes in his work and Lawson's book, which is broken up into like, she basically does a poem for every song. So it's a really cool concept. I think it worked out really well. Lawson is really good at writing about sex, which I think is kind of a rare thing for poets. Definitely is hard, so I was impressed by that. And also really liked this one longer poem in the book called The Ocean is Endless. That's definitely a standout, and I was just really impressed with Lawson's ability to like cram so many references into the book in general, but specifically that poem, like from Frank Ocean to like killer whales to Foucault, to being Black in America, and like some like quotes from different Black people about that. So I think, you know, it's impressive how referential this book is, and also how accessible it is for something that's essentially an experimental work of poetry. I was hoping that Lawson would delve a little bit more into Frank Ocean's queerness, because she does kind of get into his personal life a little bit. And, you know, I think Siegfried is the name of the song that Ocean wrote about his queer love affair, and I was a little bit disappointed that the poem that was titled that same title didn't really have anything to do with queerness, but you know, not every book can do everything, and it's really impressive how much Lawson was able to pack into like a really small book of poetry. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. It also, like, it was kind of wild for the first time to like see So, you know, in the end material of books, specifically poetry, like if you've borrowed a line for somebody or you've referenced something, you put it in the endnotes. And I was floored to see like somebody that I was in poetry classes with at the College of Charleston referenced in this book, like as something that had been inspirational for Lawson. I think probably they went to the same MFA or something or know each other, but Rena Shirali was a poet who I was in classes with in 2012, 2011. So yeah, that was pretty cool to see somebody that I like actually knew referenced as a poet. So just a side note, I again really liked I Think I'm Ready to See Frank Ocean. Also, like, I think for every book that I am recommending today, I'm just like floored by how amazing the covers are. So I'm like showing you when I have the physical copy, but also just need to put here like the covers of the books that I'm referring to because I think they're all really great. The next book that I wanted to recommend, I'm just barely not finished with. I have like 50 pages left, but it is Just Us, the newest book by Claudia Rankine. I have always loved Rankine's work. This is kind of like the end of a trilogy of books, I guess, but the other two are really just poetry, and this book is hard to classify. There's some like poetry scattered in there, but a lot of it is essays, and it is a lot of reflections on interpersonal interactions that Rankine has had. You could tell it was written during, you know, the election of Trump. That specter very much hangs over it. Oh, and the book that Rankine wrote that I was like most in love with in the past is called Citizen. If you haven't read it, you have got to. It's an amazing book of poetry that I would recommend to anyone, even if you don't usually read poetry, to really understand the Black experience in America and white supremacist violence. Also another thing I wanted to mention about Rankine's work, even beyond the books that she's written, she founded something called the Racial Imaginary Institute, which has been really inspirational to me. I saw a panel that they put on at AWP, which is like a writing conference that happens every year. It was in Portland, I think 2 years ago, and so I was fortunate to attend that panel, and it really focused on like writing whiteness, which is something that like I think is something that we all need to like understand more, that like what is whiteness, and especially like white people I think need to figure out how to write about that and write about racism in a way that's not just focusing on how we're harming people of color, but is also like, you know, James Baldwin talks about the ways that it hurts the white spirit too. Racism really has a negative impact on everyone. So that panel really talked about writing whiteness and the importance of implicating yourself, which I think is a helpful frame as a white person trying to write about racism. This book is really clear about something I've like learned in that regard. I think Claudia Rankine's doing a lot of work in the book to ask the question of what whiteness is. How do white people see their whiteness? And that helps like take off the blinders of like, oh, this is dominant culture. It's not anyone's culture. It just is. Like, that's the way things are. And I think that is a very critical piece of checking racial bias. I think there's a quote in here where Rankine's asking like to the reader, what are you thinking when you're not thinking? And I think that's an important concept that even white people who are trying to reckon with their own racism are often not really making that connection. So yeah, I think it's a very deep and challenging book. Rankin is doing a lot of her own, like, analysis of her interpersonal interactions, not just with, like, random people in the world, but, like, with friends and her white husband, and challenging her own conceptions and not just that of white people. And I thought that was really powerful. I see a lot of people in, like, reviews complaining about that personal focus and, like, how it seems kind of out of date or, like, behind because we have shifted to a dialogue about racism in this country that is more about, like, structural policies that are, like, race blind but are having, you know, maintaining very negative effects on Black and brown people in the United States. And I think that's really important, especially as somebody who's on the left and, like, does a lot of thinking about how we can change those policies, but I also think the interpersonal stuff is still important, and it is the way that most people see their own personal, like, behavior being effective. And so I think this is a really important thing too that I don't think we should discount. And I also think it has an ability to connect with people on a deeper level, I guess, than something that's talking about structural policies, which is very easy not to implicate yourself in, right? Like, that notion of implicating yourself and your whiteness in talking about race. It's more effective to do that on an interpersonal level and see, like, the way that people's actual interactions are still being colored by implicit bias. Of course, you know, Claudia Rankin teaches at Yale. She's not in the same economic precarious position as a lot of people who are Black and brown who are being affected more by some of those policies that we were talking about. There's a lack of class analysis here, but again, not every book has to do everything, and I think there's plenty of other books that you can look to for that, but I think if you are interested in sort of deeper personal analysis, this book is really great. It is kind of sad at the beginning of the book, like, the level at which she's starting to have these conversations with, like, people out in the world, asking people, like, do you think about your whiteness? Do you think about your privilege? Which I appreciate that she kind of talks about why that language is maybe not the most effective framing, but at this point it's what we've got. But yeah, she's really having to hold herself back from having a deeper conversation because of where people are at, and it is hard to read, but I also think that's just, like, the hard reality of where we are still at as a country talking about racism. Most white people are still there, and that white fragility is something that we're gonna have to build stamina around. So yeah, I could go on and on about this book. I think I would really love to have a reading group to reread this book with. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth reading. Another nonfiction book that I read that I wanted to touch on here briefly is Black Women's History of the United States by Dana Ramey Berry and Kaylee Nicole Gross. This book reads like a textbook. I actually started this book in December and I just now finished it. But I mean, we need those books too, and I think this really made me think about high school education and, like, what we're teaching, what we're failing to teach, and the focus on Black women specifically, like, made it so that I, who have spent a lot of time trying to re-educate myself around this nation's history, still, like, was very much learning new things throughout this book. The book starts with Isabel De Overa, who is a woman of African descent, who joined an expedition to New Spain in 1600. So, like, it starts really with the first Black women to be on this continent, and it goes all the way up to Patricia Okumu, who was the activist who climbed the Statue of Liberty in 2018 to protest incarceration of children at the border. So it goes, you know, throughout American history in a deep way. And I actually was like most impressed by more of the modern history that I learned. I think like there were interesting things to me throughout, but I loved the section about deeper history of the Montgomery bus boycott. I loved learning about Aurelia Browder, who was just as involved in that history as like Rosa Parks, and how many women actually were involved and how deeply they were involved before Martin Luther King like ever got on the scene in Montgomery. So that was like a highlight for me of this book. I also loved learning more about Shirley Chisholm, and some of that like more modern history. I don't know if like even in the way that we address Black history in my education, like I don't know if anybody else has this experience, but you like get to a certain point and then you just like never get to the more recent history, which is very much still history. So I really appreciated having more of that information here as well. So yeah, I really recommend this book. It's not narrative really. It's pretty like it's a textbook. But if you are committed to like doing some re-education about things that you didn't go over in school, I think it's a great place to start. So yeah, those are the books I actually like read at this point. It's the 24th, so I have like 4 more days. I'm probably not going to get to everything else that I wanted to read, but I did want to like let you know what other books I was planning to read. See, maybe I'll talk about them in a future video. But the first one that I was hoping to read is called Air Traffic, a memoir of ambition and manhood in America by Gregory Pardlow. This is a story mostly about Pardlow's relationship with his father, who was an air traffic controller and a really successful labor organizer, who was unfortunately fired during the air traffic controllers strike in 1981. If you don't know anything about that, you definitely should. I think the history of labor organizing in the United States is highly underrepresented in class as well, like in high school and college. And as somebody who was a labor organizer, and somebody who thinks that unions are definitely a way that we can start to fix a lot of our economic problems in this country, this is obviously of interest to me. So yeah, the draw of this book is really that it's highly personal. It's a memoir, but it is also encompassing issues like race, class, gender, labor. So I will see if it lives up to those expectations. I have heard this book straddles the line really between like an actual memoir and like more of a book of essays. I like both, but keeping that in mind I think will help me have clear expectations going in. So looking forward to reading that, probably in March. Other stuff that I didn't have a chance to get to, but that I'm really excited about reading, probably in March, include Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Jazi. I really loved her first book, probably the best debut novel I can think of off the top of my head, Homegoing, which was actually recommended to me by my friend Jasmine, who also has family from Ghana, like Jazi does. So I had to delay my hold on this book. I actually got the Kindle version this week, but I had to delay it because I have so many other books that I'm trying to finish, as usual, hence fully booked. And then lastly, this book called In the Wake by Christina Sharp. This was recommended to me by my friend Jesus, and I'm really excited to read it. I've heard great things about its depiction of Black life. In the Wake kind of refers to the wake of being brought in the ships to the United States in the transatlantic slave trade. This book definitely has more of like a theoretical and academic vibe, and I do think it's important to read stuff like that about race especially, but I already am reading Claudia Rankine, and so that kind of filled that same niche. So I look forward to reading this soon so I can give it back to Jesus, who let me borrow it. So yeah, those are some of the books that I read during Black History Month, some of the ones that I still want to read. You can find my Goodreads reviews of all of these books in the links below. And thank you so much for listening. Love if you hit the subscribe button. I am planning to do some more videos focused on writing by Black authors in the future. Thanks for listening.